Welcome back talking about modes, and there are main modes and sub modes on the Yamaha RM1X, and the main modes pattern chaining, pattern song is what we were talking about already before, and there are a lot of sub modes here as well as the utility main mode here. And you have pattern chaining and song mode, and when you select them, the sub modes will behave a little bit different, but most of the features are similar or even the same. So I'm going to talk about the pattern mode here for the sub modes today, but before we're doing that, we're going to talk about the utility page first. So the utility or the first utility page is configuring the master tune of the overall box, as well as it allows the behavior of your foot switch to be changed, and you can also change the pattern quantization as well as the memory protect. And the memory protect is pretty nice. When you turn it on, all your user sets can't be changed, so it's kind of like a way of not overwriting whatever you already programmed on this machine. And anyway, you should save your data to disk. I think having a backup is always good, because also your battery could be empty, for example, which would make your memory protect fail in this case as well. It's not happening that often, but it can happen, just for you to keep in mind. Okay, there's a second page on the utility, which allows you to configure MIDI very precisely. It's sometimes very useful to configure specific MIDI sync options, or to change the MTC start offset when it comes to like several MIDI devices with different timings and so on. And you can also change the MIDI control as well as the echo back. And you can also define very precisely what in terms of MIDI is supposed to be sent out and what's supposed to be coming in and what is filtered out, basically. So you can select and deselect different MIDI types. Okay, so there's several sub modes, and when you click on the groove mode, for example, here you can select several steps, and you can apply, for example, note offset per step, or clock shift, or gate offset. And when you select other steps, you can apply again other offsets again, and velocity offsets. So it's really nice in terms of like getting some instant groove in place and adding some variation, for example, with the clock shift, or with the velocity. Also in terms of sending those signals out to MIDI, it's sometimes really useful. Okay, so there's a PlayFX mode in which you can first of all configure unison up to 8 voices. So you have an octaver for your voices. You can also harmonize your voices, which is basically adding a note on top of your root note for each of the harmonizers. And you can also use it for layering drums, for example, if you have a drum kit. In the second page, you can apply beat stretch to your pattern, clock shifting, the gate time, and the velocity offset as well. There's also MIDI delay, which is really nice and quite feature-rich, I would say. So you have a delay time, a delay level, and repeat times, but you can also configure the feedback velocity, the feedback note, gate time, and clock, which is really nice. And also, again, that it can be sent out via MIDI. So it's also a really nice option for a MIDI delay for your MIDI devices, in case polyphony is okay with that. There's also an arpeggiator. And the arpeggiator is pretty standard, I would say. Like you see, these options are pretty standard to many other arpeggiators. The funny thing here is there's a random mode, which is sometimes adding a lot of wildness to your arpeggiator. Okay, and by the way, those dots next to the modes are an indicator for how many level deep a specific mode can be, and you can get back to a level up with the exit button. So for example, here we have 4 menus or 4 modes deep, and you can click 4 times to get to the lowest level of menu, and you can get 1 level back with the exit button. Okay, our next mode is the voice mode, and this one should be familiar to you in case you watched the previous videos. So you can change your voice here in a bank and in a program. You can pan it with this button, and you can change the volume. And in the second page, you can apply some variation, which is an effect, and the effect can later on be changed. as well as the chorus and as well as the reverb can be refined later on in one of the effect menus. And there's a dry level to be applied. And if you want to dive more into voice editing, then you would probably want the voice editing menu or want to explore the voice editing menu. Here you have an attack, a decay, a release, like a typical envelope. You have the pitch bend range, the pitch bend itself, the portamento time to be configured, as well as you have an LFO in which you can define the rate and you can apply it to pitch, filter, and amplifier. There's also cutoff and the corresponding resonance. So there's a setup menu in which you can define a frequency on which you want to do a bass roll off, or you want to maybe like boost your bass. That's the page in which you can configure it. You can configure all of those knobs here to have different behavior. For example, we are in the beat stretch mode right now. You can select them with this knob here, and depending on in which mode you're in, you can select different ones. You can also just like turn them, and you would select the particular knob, and you can, for example, change the harmonize 1 to something else like CC or 7 volume or reverb send or whatever, and you can also make them stick to specific tracks rather than acting automatically for what track is currently selected. There's another menu in which you can also configure your tracks to either send to the internal sound engine, which is TG, or to MIDI out. So you can also turn them off. For example, you want on the 16th track, for example, only send MIDI out to not trigger the internal sound engine. So here you can turn the internal engine off and the MIDI out, and on all the other tracks you could do the same, but the other way around by turning MIDI off, for example. Okay, so that was the setup menu. I actually skipped the effect menu, which we can just look into right now. So we have the variation that I was talking about earlier that we can apply to different tracks. You have different kinds of effects that you can select in here, and you can configure them in a later page. You have different choruses, different reverbs, and you can also have the variation connection a bit set up a bit different. Either it comes after the mixer, so you can apply them with dry wet level, very usual to your different tracks, and with insert you have it even before the mixer, but then you can only apply it to one of the tracks, just for you to be aware of. And in the next page you can configure the variation, and you can have like very different types of gate in this case, so you can have different parameters depending on which effect you were selecting. And in the next one we have the chorus, which very typical with very typical parameters, and you can also have reverb parameters defined very precisely. Okay, so there's the disk menu. In here you can save your files, your patterns, your sets, and you can use a default name in case you configured a name for your set, and you can select different chars here, enter them, and then you can click save, and it's going to save to disk. And you can also, of course, like load from your disk specific files, and you can change the target in which, for example, this pattern is supposed to be loading. You can rename your files, and you can also delete them, and that's basically it. Also nice to try out the format. It sounds like being back in the 90s. Okay, so there's also the job mode, in which we can not get in right now because we enabled the memory protect. The memory protect is just like preventing me from applying any changes to my current patterns. So this was effectively working. So when I click the job mode right now, I can see there are a lot of jobs that I can select, and you can select between different categories here. There is the undo redo in the very first row, and you can also apply this by hitting shift and clicking job anytime and everywhere, in almost everywhere in your workflow. And The other options here are pretty nice as well. For example, the quantize option to quantize specific phrases and to modify the velocity at once or the gate time. With crescendo, you can make kind of like evolving patterns and like just explore most of them. Maybe you don't want to explore all of them at the beginning, but I would at least encourage you to look into what they are about and like getting a feeling on how you can apply them. And I think like maybe you don't need them all the time, but yeah, once you know what they're about, it's sometimes useful to apply specific things. It makes you go faster sometimes and fix things when you broke them. Okay, so there's the event section or event category in which your events can be manipulated, and there's the phrases section in which you can change your phrases or yeah, exchange phrases, for example, or append them. You can split them. You see, I think it's self-explaining most of the time. And I like this one a lot because sometimes I'm just building up tracks, and usually I have a specific way on how I would like to have the different tracks organized. For example, on the second one, I would always have the bass, and sometimes I'm just in the flow of creating something, and it ends up having a hi-hat here, for example, on the second track. And with the exchange track, you can easily exchange them. Like you have, for example, the bass here, the hi-hat here, and can just like say exchange 2 with 6, and then it's gonna exchange it easily. Okay, so there are a lot of different nice features in here. Also, for example, divide drum track. So if you have one track, you played some drums in, you can use divide drum track to automatically split out your first track based on the category, based on the sounds you were playing across different tracks and so on. So it's also something that adds a lot of speedness to your workflow. It's really nice once knowing them. Okay, so also in the copy pattern and also in the pattern mode, you have several options which make life easier. For example, if you want to copy a pattern, which is basically a section copying from A to B, and you want to keep the reference to your phrases, for example, then this option is really nice. We covered that in one of the earlier videos in case you're interested. Okay, so there's also the edit menu, which we can only do in the user mode. And in the user mode, when we click edit, we see that here you can usually, because right now there's no MIDI information because it's a blank pattern, but you have lots of MIDI information about your current pattern in here, and you can also modify it and send, for example, or add some specific messages and send them out. So this is also quite detailed way of working with MIDI, and you can also define on what specific MIDI categories you would want to be sending or not. And there's also the split mode, and we covered this in one of the earlier videos. This is used to have sections split up across different other sections and copy them and like taking copies in a very specific way. But if you watch the earlier videos, then you know exactly what I'm talking about right now. If you don't know, then yeah, check out the earlier videos and you will know.